It's over, Richard. I'm staying in Paris. I've emptied our joint account for a fresh start. Don't try to find me. The text lit up my phone at 3 a.m., jolting me from sleep. 15 years of marriage ended in a single message while I was 4,000 miles away, working the night shift to pay for her dream vacation. My name is Richard Sullivan, 42, a network security specialist for a major financial institution in Boston. I've spent the last decade building firewalls by day and a marriage by night, though apparently I'd only been successful at one of them. Melanie and I met in college, married young, and built what I thought was a solid life together. No kids, she never wanted them, but we had a comfortable colonial in a good neighborhood, respectable careers, and the appearance of happiness. At least that's what I believed. "This can't be happening," I whispered to our empty bedroom. But the bank notification that followed her text confirmed it. Our joint account, containing just over $38,000, had been emptied hours earlier. 15 years of trust, dissolved in an international wire transfer. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, buried under my willful ignorance. The growing distance over the past year. Her sudden interest in learning French. The way she insisted on taking this 2-week Paris trip alone, to find herself, while I stayed behind to work. And perhaps most telling, how adamant she'd been about keeping her maiden name on her passport when we married, something that had seemed like a minor feminist stance at the time, but now felt calculated. The Paris trip had been her idea, her dream since college. I'd finally saved enough to surprise her for our 15th anniversary, booking her in boutique hotels, arranging private tours of museums, even setting up a sunset dinner near the Eiffel Tower. What I didn't know was that I had financed not a vacation, but an escape plan. I called her immediately, of course, straight to voicemail, again. I sent texts that shifted from confused to desperate to angry, all left unread according to the mocking absence of delivery confirmations. Finally, I tried logging into our joint email account, locked out, password changed. That first night, I didn't sleep. I paced our bedroom, pausing occasionally to stare at her side of the closet, still full of clothes she clearly didn't plan to return for. In our bathroom cabinet, her expensive skincare products remained neatly arranged, sacrificial offerings she could afford to abandon now that she had $38,000 of our money. My money, primarily. I'd always been the higher earner, though she'd contributed. By morning, the shock had crystallized into something harder, colder. My IT security training kicked in, not the technical skills, but the methodical approach to problem solving, the ability to think several steps ahead. I made coffee and sat at our kitchen island, opening my laptop. "If you're going to betray me, Mel," I said to the empty kitchen, "you should have married someone who doesn't understand digital forensics." First, I checked our credit cards. 2 were maxed out, charges from Parisian hotels, boutiques, restaurants. Not just for one person, I noticed. Many charges showed covers for 2 at romantic restaurants. So there was someone else. Of course there was. I pulled up our cell phone bill. For months, there had been frequent calls to the same French number. I had never noticed, never checked. Trust makes you blind. I spent the rest of that day cataloging the extent of her betrayal. Methodically, like documenting malware behavior. Not out of vindictiveness, but because I needed to understand the attack vector. Then I remembered something that made me freeze mid-keystroke. My separate savings account. The one Melanie didn't know existed. When I was promoted 3 years ago, I'd set up an automatic transfer of $1,000 monthly to a high-yield savings account in my name only. Not because I was planning for divorce, I truly wasn't, but because my father had drummed financial caution into me after his own devastating divorce decades earlier. "Always have your own parachute, son," he'd said, even in the happiest marriage. I'd felt guilty about it, the secret account that had accumulated nearly $42,000. Now it felt like foresight. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. Instead, I drove to my bank and spent 2 hours with a sympathetic personal banker named Teresa. "I need to protect what's left," I explained, showing her the empty joint account. Teresa helped me set up fraud alerts, remove Melanie's access to my personal accounts, and cancel joint credit cards. She also helped me pull my credit report to ensure Melanie hadn't opened any accounts in my name. She hadn't. At least she'd drawn the line at identity theft. "This happens more often than you'd think," Teresa said kindly as I signed the paperwork. "You're doing the right things to protect yourself now." I next visited a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a similar situation. Sandra Levine was a no-nonsense litigator with a reputation for handling international divorce cases. "So your wife emptied your joint account from France and told you she's not coming back," Sandra summarized after I explained my situation. "And you have documentation of her apparent affair. That gives us several options." "I want to be fair," I said, "but I also don't want to be taken advantage of further." Sandra nodded. "First, we file for divorce, citing abandonment and adultery. The abandoned marital home works in your favor. Her taking the joint funds will not look good to a judge, especially since texts show she intended it as a permanent departure." "Will we be able to get any of that money back?" I asked. "Possibly, but international financial recovery is complicated. However," she leaned forward, "given the circumstances, we might get a judgment allowing you to keep most or all of your retirement accounts and the house equity as offset. Massachusetts isn't particularly generous to spouses who abandon the marriage and clean out joint accounts." I signed the retainer agreement that day. The divorce filing would take a few days to prepare, giving me time for my next steps. When I returned home, I sat in the driveway staring at our house, the one we'd bought 7 years ago with such excitement, the one where I'd installed smart home technology throughout as a labor of love. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Our entire smart home system was still under my control. All of it. The security cameras, the cloud storage of footage, the digital locks, the network access, all tied to my personal accounts that Melanie had never bothered to learn about because that's your tech stuff. She'd never even downloaded the apps to her phone. That evening, I logged into our home security system and downloaded months of footage. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I found it. Melanie bringing a man into our home while I was at a cybersecurity conference in Chicago 3 months earlier. Footage showed them entering the house, drinking wine in our kitchen, and heading upstairs to our bedroom. My stomach lurched. I stopped the footage, unable to watch more, but the timestamps told me he'd stayed for nearly 6 hours. I checked other dates when I'd been traveling for work. The same man appeared 5 more times. In my house. In my bed. I wasn't just funding her escape, I'd been funding their affair for months. The next day brought an unexpected development. A call from our mortgage bank, asking about the missed payment. Confused, I checked our mortgage autopay account. The funds had been withdrawn from our joint account as usual on the 1st of the month, 3 days before Melanie cleaned it out. But the payment had been reversed 2 days later. Somehow, Melanie had managed to claw back even the mortgage payment to add to her haul. The bank representative was understanding when I explained the situation, agreeing to waive the late fee while I set up a new payment for my personal account. After hanging up, I sat at our kitchen table, anger building like a gathering storm. This wasn't just abandonment. This was calculated financial sabotage. I called Sandra again. "She reversed our mortgage payment," I explained. "She's actively trying to damage my credit and financial standing." "Document everything," Sandra advised. "This strengthens our case." I spent that evening going through our financial records, documenting every joint account, every asset, every expense. As I worked, I remembered something else, something I'd almost forgotten in the chaos: the life insurance policy. 4 years ago, I'd taken out a substantial life insurance policy naming Melanie as the beneficiary. Given recent events, leaving that intact seemed foolish. The next morning, I called the insurance company and changed the beneficiary to my sister. As I worked through these practical matters, the emotional reality of Melanie's betrayal continued to hit in waves. I'd find myself staring at her empty side of the closet or catching a whiff of her perfume from a forgotten scarf, and the pain would feel fresh again. But each time, I'd return to my methodical approach. Document, secure, protect, plan. A week after Melanie's text, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize, melanie.carter@gmail.com. She'd created a new account using her maiden name. The message was brief. I need you to transfer the money from our investment account. I'll send details for where to wire it. I hope you understand that I needed to make this change. We've been growing apart for years. I stared at the screen, astounded by her audacity. No apology, no acknowledgement of the damage done, just an expectation that I would continue funding her new life. What she didn't know, what she had never bothered to learn during our marriage, was that our investment account wasn't just any account. It was my separately managed retirement portfolio, set up before our marriage and maintained entirely with my income. She was listed as the beneficiary, but had no ownership stake or withdrawal rights. In our state, premarital retirement accounts maintained separately throughout the marriage largely remained separate property. I forwarded the email to Sandra without responding to Melanie. Perfect, Sandra replied within minutes. This demonstrates her intent to continue taking marital assets. Don't respond. 2 days later, our divorce petition was filed. Sandra had expedited the process given the unusual circumstances and the risk of further financial damage. The same day, I received a notification from one of our joint credit cards. Melanie had attempted to make a $3,200 purchase at a Parisian boutique, but the card had been declined because I'd closed the account. Within hours, another email arrived from Melanie. Why are the credit cards not working? I need access to our finances. This is unfair and cruel. Again, I forwarded it to Sandra without responding. She advised continuing radio silence while the legal process moved forward. The following week brought another development. My phone rang with an international number I didn't recognize. Richard? It's Jean-Claude Beaumont. The accented voice belonged to a work contact I'd met at several cybersecurity conferences in Europe. I saw your wife yesterday. My grip tightened on the phone. In Paris? Yes, at Café Laurent. She was with Pierre Dubois. I thought you should know. Pierre Dubois. Finally, a name to the face in my security footage. And not just any name. Pierre was a French technology executive I'd met through work 3 years earlier. He'd visited Boston for a conference where he must have met Melanie. The pieces were falling into place. Thank you for telling me, I managed. We're no longer together. I suspected as much when I saw them. They seemed intimate. I'm sorry, mon ami. After we hung up, I searched for Pierre online and found his LinkedIn profile. Executive at a French software company. Recently divorced himself. Frequently traveled to Boston for business. I forwarded his information to Sandra. This helps, she confirmed. Especially if he's been in your home, as the security footage shows. 3 weeks after Melanie's departure, Sandra called with unexpected news. The French bank froze the funds she transferred. What? How? International transfers over certain amounts trigger automatic reviews for potential money laundering. Since she moved the entire account in one transaction and immediately began spending lavishly, it raised flags. They've temporarily frozen the remainder pending investigation. How much is left? I asked, hardly daring to hope. About $22,000. She spent nearly $16,000 in 3 weeks. I let out a low whistle. That's actually great news. It gets better, Sandra continued. Because of the freeze, we've been able to file an emergency petition with the court, claiming those funds as disputed marital assets. The judge granted a temporary hold until our divorce proceedings are further along. For the first time since Melanie's text, I felt a glimmer of justice on the horizon. Not revenge. I wasn't interested in punishing her, but a rebalancing of scales that had tipped wildly against me. That weekend, I finally did something I'd been putting off. I packed up Melanie's belongings, not in anger, but in acceptance. As I carefully boxed her clothes, books, and personal items, I felt a strange sense of closure beginning to form. I labeled each box meticulously and moved them to the garage, then cleaned the house thoroughly, erasing the lingering traces of her presence. 5 weeks after her departure, my phone lit up with that same international number. Melanie, My heart raced despite myself, but I let it go to voicemail. Her message came through seconds later. "Richard, this has gone far enough. I can't access any of our money. The bank is asking questions I can't answer. Call me back immediately." I played it for Sandra during our meeting the next day. "Perfect," she said. "Don't respond. Let her come to us." 2 days later, Melanie's first direct communication since her departure text arrived via email. "I've received divorce papers. This is unnecessary and vindictive. We could have handled this amicably. I need access to our accounts immediately. I have expenses and commitments here. If you release the funds and agree to favorable terms, I won't fight the divorce." Sandra helped craft a response, our first direct communication back to Melanie. "All financial matters will be handled through the divorce proceedings. Your removal of joint funds without consent and abandonment of the marital home have been documented with the court. My attorney will be in touch regarding next steps." The response came within minutes. "You can't do this to me. I have rights to that money. I'll fight you for everything if you don't release the funds immediately." Sandra's advice was simple. Document and ignore. This strengthens our position. 2 months after Melanie's departure, we received notice that she had retained a Boston-based attorney. The game was changing. She was coming back to fight. "This is actually good news," Sandra assured me. "Fighting the divorce from France would have complicated things enormously. If she's working with a local attorney, that suggests she's planning to return." "Is she allowed to just come back to the house?" I asked, suddenly concerned. "Technically, it's still her legal residence, but given the abandonment circumstances, we filed for exclusive use of the marital home pending divorce. The hearing is next week." The judge granted the exclusive use order, meaning Melanie couldn't simply return and move back in. The mortgage and utilities remained in my name, and I had maintained them flawlessly since her departure. 3 months after she left, Melanie landed at Boston Logan International Airport. I know this because Pierre Dubois was not with her. The French dream had evidently lost its luster once the money dried up. She tried to call me repeatedly that day. I maintained silence, directing all communication through Sandra. Her attorney reached out for a settlement conference, which we agreed to schedule. The day before the settlement conference, Sandra called with unexpected news. The French bank completed their investigation. They've determined the transfer was legitimate in a technical sense. Melanie had legal access to the account, but are maintaining the hold on the remaining funds pending our court's decision, given the divorce proceedings. So the money's still there? Yes, and we have a strong claim to it given the circumstances. The settlement conference was scheduled at Sandra's office. I arrived early, anxiety churning in my stomach at the prospect of seeing Melanie for the first time since her departure. When she walked in with her attorney, I barely recognized her. Gone was the confident, stylish woman I'd been married to, replaced by someone who looked tired, stressed, and significantly less polished. Her eyes met mine briefly before looking away. No greeting, no acknowledgement. The meeting proceeded with clinical efficiency. Our attorneys outlined positions while we sat in silence. Melanie's attorney argued she was entitled to half of all marital assets, including my retirement accounts and the house. Sandra countered with evidence of abandonment, financial misconduct, and adultery, arguing for a significantly reduced settlement. When the discussion turned to the frozen funds in France, Melanie finally spoke. "That money was for my fresh start," she said, her voice tight. "I earned it during our marriage. You contributed approximately 22% to that joint account over the past 5 years," Sandra replied coolly, sliding documents across the table. "The remaining 78% came from Richard's income, which substantially exceeded yours throughout the marriage." Melanie's attorney whispered something to her, and she fell silent again. By the end of the 4-hour meeting, we had the framework of a settlement. I would keep the house and my retirement accounts. She would get her car, which was paid off, her personal belongings, and a reduced portion of the frozen funds in France, approximately $8,000 of the remaining $22,000. The rest would be returned to me. As we were leaving, Melanie approached me in the hallway, her attorney a few steps behind. "I never meant to hurt you," she said quietly. "It just happened." I looked at her. This woman I'd loved for 15 years. This stranger who had emptied our account and walked away from our life without a backward glance. "Nothing just happens, Mel," I replied, my voice even. "You made choices. So did I. Now we're both living with them." 2 weeks later, the settlement was finalized. 6 months after that text that had shattered my world, our divorce was official. The French bank eventually released the funds as directed by the court. I received approximately $14,000 back, a fraction of what had been taken, but more than I'd expected to recover. Melanie moved to a smaller city about 50 miles away, taking a job similar to her previous one. Pierre Dubois, I heard through mutual acquaintances, had returned to his ex-wife in Paris. Sometimes clichés exist for a reason. As for me, I stayed in our house, my house now. I maintained the garden Melanie had started, repainted the kitchen a color I preferred, and slowly reclaimed the space as my own. The smart home system was simplified, the security cameras repositioned to cover only the exterior. I never did tell Melanie about my separate savings account, the one that had saved me from financial ruin when she emptied our joint account. In the months after her departure, it had grown to nearly $50,000 with additional deposits. My parachute, as my father had called it, had deployed perfectly. Sometimes I wonder if Melanie ever realized how thoroughly she had underestimated me, not just financially, but emotionally. She'd assumed I would crumble, beg her to reconsider, or at least fight to communicate with her. Instead, I had quietly gathered the pieces of my broken life and reassembled them into something new, something stronger and entirely mine. A year after our divorce was finalized, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was a key, the key to our house that Melanie had taken with her to Paris, and a short note: "I'm sorry, you deserved better. M." I placed the key in my desk drawer without reply. Some wounds heal with time, but they still leave scars, invisible reminders of lessons painfully learned. My scar reminds me that while trust is valuable, self-reliance is essential. Little did she know when she left me for her dream life, that I had been preparing for the worst while hoping for the best throughout our marriage. That quiet preparation didn't save my marriage, but it saved me. And in the end, that was enough.